Welcome to Threatsafe. This is our podcast to help SMEs and SMBs and the people who manage IT within those businesses or responsible for IT to get the very best from the technology that they deploy and then also to manage their cybersecurity. Let's listen to this week's podcast. Hello everybody, welcome to episode 5 of Threatsafe. I'm Martin Roberts, Managing Director of Newways.
And I'm Toby Stevenson, Chief Technology Officer at Newways.
Thank you for reminding me, Toby. Much appreciated. The last few episodes quite enjoyed actually, because it's a bit theoretical and not about specific threats and things like that. And I don't know how long you've been in the industry for, Toby. How long have you been around IT?
Well, I will say that I was in the IT industry when Windows 95 came out.
Okay. I'm going to talk about DOS if you want.
I remember DOS. I remember Windows 3.1 and NetWare 3 and NT4.
Well, I'm more on the application side. I always have been, and the enterprise side. And I did my first CRM implementation, what was sort of called CRM these days, in 1985. And sometimes I sit in meetings and announce that to the assembled people, and a lot of people go, "I wasn't born then," and I look at them and they go, "You weren't born then." Anyway, so we've seen trends, Toby, over time, and
yeah,
I think when I really got into the IT industry, there were always trends, and there's always something. There's always I now call it, there was always a bandwagon people were jumping on, and you could hear the wheels beginning to roll. And I remember things like 3-tier architecture, client server, But we're going to talk a bit about infrastructure today, and what the trends are, and what they've been, and where we think it might be going. Because obviously of interest, hopefully to our audience, to our listeners here, is that how do we talked about planning last time. You still got to plan and forecast the next 3 to 5 years. What's going to happen? And whatever you write down, it's wrong. But there you go. So Toby, when you first started in the industry, what was the predominant model?
It was definitely client server. Actually, I got into the industry actually with an organisation who were just on the start of the client server model. So they had previously been what you would call dumb client, dumb terminal, thin client, from a mainframe perspective.
Now let's just for the people who aren't old enough to appreciate this, or actually, it's not interesting per se. What was new about client server?
Yeah, so prior to that, in the era of the mainframe, you had this really huge computer that did all of the processing, and you accessed that through a dumb terminal that had no brains in it. It just connected to a session on the big computer, and that was great because there was a lot of control, but it also meant there was very little customization or moving outside the guardrails that were provided by the system, and so client server, I think for 2 reasons, became very popular. The first was that it was just the general accessibility. It was much cheaper to buy a server and a bunch of PCs to deliver a particular computing workload than a mainframe. It didn't need such skilled people. It didn't need this specialized environment. But it also meant that actually you could do more interesting things. And I always remember in my first job, one of the perennial help desk tickets that would come in was when somebody was running what we would call an antisocial transaction on the mainframe, because it basically broke everybody else until it was either finished or it was killed. And moving to that client server, you move the compute mostly away from the server onto the client.
Yeah.
And that's when we then started getting into this race about computers getting faster and faster, and there was the clock speeds were going through the roof, and more and more processor. And this is where Moore's law became this thing, the doubling of processing capability every year ad infinitum, and the chip manufacturers were struggling to keep up with that particular prediction. So Moore was I think he was a researcher at Intel, and basically predicted that, with the architecture they've got, processor performance would double year on year, and that kind of like led to like some huge improvements in terms of generalized computing power, but also the cost of doing computing. It brought the price of that right down, and capitalizing on those environments were Microsoft with their Windows operating system. That was kind of the de facto leader. There were other players in the space, but for one reason or another, nature decided that they weren't to be successful, and kind of fell by the wayside. So that's kind of that's that whole client server piece, and it's what we kind of understand today when we talk about PCs and servers. You have this PC that you run all your applications on, and you use the server for hosting data or running a database application or something like that.
Okay, so and typical of that we'll call it architecture, and what did you need and where did it need to be to run your business?
Yeah, so this is the era of dial-up modem. So we didn't have super fast internet connections. Everything sat in a chilled room in the office, because cooling wasn't great on equipment, and they ran hot, so they needed air conditioning normally. You would be connected through some manner of network cabling. This is before Wi-Fi, to the server, through some kind of networking equipment, whether it be a switch or the predecessor, the hub. And you would be connecting probably at the blistering speeds of either 10 or 100 megabits per second to the server. This is the era when you would install Windows 95 from about 28 floppy disks.
Yes. Gosh, I remember those. In fact, I may still have some in the den. Okay, so but as a company, you would be you'd be making big investments.
Yeah. PCs were expensive.
Yeah.
Particularly compared to today. They were probably £800-900, £1,000 a go, which adjusted for real time would be a lot more expensive than you buy a PC for now. Servers again expensive, and very big. Almost looking like under counter fridges in some cases. Big beast of things. So generally speaking, very, very big, very bulky, and relatively expensive in comparison.
And what we found companies doing, what they have to do is, and even later on to some degree, they would have to have the environment to put these computers in. Obviously, highly secure, one would hope, air conditioned, one would hope, and then they'd probably, we call it on premise. And those machines were sitting there at their sites, be looked after by fairly highly skilled people or third-party contractors. And the spending pattern there would be every 3, if you were lucky, every 5 to 7 years, there would be a big expenditure to replace all of that with the latest hardware. As you said a couple of episodes ago, actually, not say the latest hardware, it might have been 2 years old then, and the software that was run on that.
And I think just the other thing to add is that way back then, and again, I think this is important, kind of in like the evolution of how networks and infrastructure has evolved, because the connectivity was so poor and very expensive. Multiple sites often operated in isolation and had to come up with very exotic ways of sharing a handful of files for consolidation in any central location. So it might have been a week's worth of effort was rolled up into a spreadsheet, and that was somehow sent over to the central site, who would then have some macros that compiled it all into one spreadsheet and then looked at the numbers. So comms was definitely a limiting factor in those days as well.
Yeah. And that's the thing that's actually revolutionized a lot, and we'll talk about that again in a lot. So then we moved to people going, hey, we've been investing in this. Can we make this easier for companies? And they then set up, some people set up data centers and sold a space in the data center, so you didn't have your own controlled room. And then sometimes people sell space on computers that they owned and rent them out. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. So what happened eventually as a result of Moore's law being played out over the course of many years is that actually computer hardware got more powerful than you needed it to be.
Yeah.
And so there was this opportunity to share a physical piece of hardware across multiple servers, for example. Yeah. So again, talking about this going cyclical, mainframes used to do this with something that they would refer to as time slicing.
Yeah.
And so you take this huge room-sized computer and you divvy it up into smaller computers and let different people do different things on it, even though it's the same physical hardware. And so the same mentality applied with servers. And then at the same kind of time, an organization came out that started to leverage this not excess, but this extra computing capability to run multiple copies of a Windows desktop.
Yeah.
So you could have lots of different desktop machines running on one server. So organizations started to move away in some parts from having PCs on every desk because that started to get expensive to buy them and difficult to manage them. You had to keep buying this thing called antivirus for every computer and all these kinds of things. And so again, went back to kind of this dumb terminal mainframe mentality where you actually had a device with a relatively small amount of computing power that was just enough to connect to this server that was going to give you like a Windows desktop to run from. And so your computing all ran on this remote server, which may have been in the server room, or it may have been, as you say, in one of these data center offerings. And it gave another way of working. It really opened up the capabilities of remote access. These solutions were born in a time when, again, there wasn't huge amounts of bandwidth available. So they worked over much smaller connections than we would enjoy today, and meant that people could actually then work from home because they could just log onto a desktop and access all their files and everything, and they weren't waiting hours for even a simple file to download to their PC.
And now we're going to really fast forward now. Actually, we went through what I'll then sort of say is a hybrid situation where some computing moved more locally, and then some people still use these. We call them mainframes, but and especially what has become nowadays, excuse me, cloud-based computing. Because, by the way, folks, no secret here that cloud-based computing are just computers owned by somebody else in their data centers rented out to you, in a different model, and they're still computers. We've seen a huge thing. We talked about this last time, driven by the pandemic, where we now have we've seen a significant shift in the past 4 or 5 years, Toby, whereby we've gone from people having servers and using a few cloud services to it's flipping entirely the other way, where they only have servers these days, in theory, because they can't do that. They can't use that system on anything else. Is it going to stay like that, or are we seeing another change?
Yeah, I think we're starting to see a bit of a tipping point again. There's some data that came out last week, and again, it's predictions, but larger organizations, because they're unable to predict accurately enough what their cloud costs are going to be, they're reverting to the let's buy our own hardware and put it in our own room, and we'll know how much it's going to cost for the next 5 years. So they are fixing their costs by moving things back on premise, because the nature of how the cloud providers and specifically not necessarily the SaaS providers, but the platform as a service and the infrastructure as a service providers, there's a high degree of unpredictability because of they are very much usage based. Some are usage based, some are kind of priced in tiers. So you get this much compute and then this much compute, and if you kind of fall in between, you have to pay the more expensive. So you end up paying for stuff that you don't use.
And of course, you can't.
Also, I was going to say, and when that scales to hundreds or even thousands of servers, it can be quite an expensive thing to have to deal with.
And it's actually, it's all market forces to some degree. I mean, at the end of the day, if you move to a model whereby you're being charged per byte, per megabyte, per terabyte for storage, and they can charge what they want because they're dominant or the market is in, how can we put it, is seeing how things settle out to work out their pricing models. There will be a bubble in pricing, and one reaction of that will be to move things back on premise. As you say, people investing in big money and bringing things back on site or into their own data centers or into third-party data centers where they actually own the kit. Because actually buying, I'm sorry to use this odd expression, hard disks, the cost per megabyte hard is really, really cheap money by comparison what it used to be in those old days when and therefore you can set the cost. Well, one of the things about, when we talked about this last time, forecasting and budgeting is a horrible pastime. It's really boring. It doesn't produce anything, and it's always wrong. But the truth is that it's quite difficult to go into a budgeting period whereby you don't know if the vendor's going to put their price per megabyte up in the next 12 months, 24 months, 18 months, by a price which is significant, and you can't predict for. You can either predict it and be wrong, or give yourself a bit of a budget surplus, hopefully, because they don't put it up to the same degree, or you don't predict it. You can avoid that unpredictability in theory by doing a huge capex, putting the stuff on your own servers in your own data center or third-party data center, and say, I'm not going to worry about that for the next 5 years.
Absolutely. I mean, and we've said time and again that the cheapest way of doing anything is to put it in a server and stick it in your office.
Yes.
The problem is that it's not always an apples and apples comparison with the cloud providers. So you're not getting the same degree of connectivity, you're not getting the same degree of resiliency, but if you can rationalize it and get your head around it, then it can be a cheaper option. And the big companies that are looking at making these moves out of AWS and Azure and things like that, they've got hundreds, thousands of servers, so they can, even at that scale, they can justify building 2 or 3 data centers and sticking a dozen people in each and having all these other things, and it still work out cheaper, and not necessarily massively cheaper, but more predictable. One of the real dangers with the cloud providers is that they decide they want to continue having their double-digit or triple-digit growth. They just stick 1% on everybody's bill. Yeah, and that over the scale of everything, that makes a massive difference. And I'm not saying that it does happen, but you can see a situation where they go in with loss leaders, get people on there, get them committed, and then you don't have then any flexibility to back out of it, and that's the real challenge. And what I will say is SaaS, so software as a service, which is what we consider like your M365 and Salesforce and HubSpot and NetSuite and all those kinds of things. They're all SaaS applications. They are less so like that, because you're buying actually a whole service. You're buying the licensing for the software, the expertise to keep all that running. You don't need to have a Exchange administrator and a SharePoint administrator and a Salesforce administrator and on staff, because actually you've got someone doing all that stuff in the background for you. But if you are hosting your own infrastructure and applications in the cloud, this is the time when the biggest organizations are doing that evaluation to see whether it's more cost effective to self-provide that cloud, because you can still buy everything and run it like it's the cloud. It's just that instead of it being somebody else's server, it's actually your server.
It's your server, and you're in control, and you've got that predictability in theory. And actually, the truth be told is that I can see it going lots of different ways. One, where the big boys go, the rest will go. Some people would say I'm going to offer a service which is like that,
Mm.
which will look very similar to buying space on a server somewhere else. It'd just be cheaper.
Mm. Well, I mean, we spoke a couple of episodes ago around, this leading edge, bleeding edge stuff,
Yes.
and how it may be an established technology, but you're just using it in a different way to give you that competitive edge. So it's not necessarily inherently risky, but you're just doing something differently.
Yeah.
And I was reading an article actually about an organization that was had switched some of their functions from one cloud provider to another because of the billing model was different.
Yes.
So the billing model that they moved to was, and it sounds ridiculous when you think of it this way, but it was how many milliseconds of processor time were being used. And in the first provider, they were billed in chunks, so it was like 3 seconds at a time. Well, they were running things that were taking like 300 milliseconds, so they were being billed for 700 milliseconds when they were never using it.
Wow.
And so they moved to this other provider that was saying, well, we'll just bill you on a per millisecond basis.
Yeah.
And so they've like saved like 2/3 of their cost because of that.
Wow.
And so that's not necessarily that's a disruptive technology, I suppose. It's using something in a different way, and that's how this new cloud provider, or this different cloud provider, has twisted things to gain that competitive edge.
So I think what we'll see over the next few years, here we are, prediction time, which is going to be completely wrong, is some move back to some on-premise for certain things, whether it's on-premise, generally on-premise, your own place, or in third-party providers. But also the other thing that will come in probably from the left-hand side probably is the commoditization of the cost of the pricing of the processing and the storage. And there's a big battle to take place because they've set their own prices for the past few years. You want to have space on that service or that service, whatever. The price, this is our price. There will be cost pressures coming in, price pressures coming in, and so we might actually see not necessarily definitive movement, it never is, from one model to another. But what we'll see is people having the opportunity to use different models because of not because the technology fundamentally changes, but the way it's used, but more importantly, the way it's built.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and we're touching the value from the licensing and things like that, and it's kind of like there's two things that are odd here. People want this bundled thing so that it's predictable and they get all this stuff in there, but then they also want to be billed fairly for what they're using, and it's where's that happy medium.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting conversation yet again, Toby. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you everybody for listening and watching. If you've been brave enough, really appreciate you coming along here. As again, we've always said this is for people who have an interest in IT, manage IT, responsible for IT, but not actually do the day-to-day stuff. A little bit here of predictions going on and things, but it's stuff we've seen before and will continue to evolve, and actually should be part of your planning going forward. You need to speak to your MSP, your IT provider, if you're in that cycle now and you've got big decisions to make, because just accepting what you've got today or what the crowd is shouting out is not necessarily the right answer, particularly if you're planning for the next 3 to 5 years. That be fair to say, Toby?
Yeah, I think so. And I think the other thing just to take away is if you're listening and you are from an SME organization, a lot of the stuff we're talking about is at that high scale, high end enterprise stuff. Yeah. The reality is that there's a lot of SMB organizations, as they look to transition from on-premise to the cloud, they tend to just jump straight to software as a service, to SaaS applications, and it's that infrastructure as a service and platform as a service where there can be a lot of cost that's unpredictable, let's say, and difficult to quantify. The SaaS offerings are more predictable. It's about establishing value.
And I suppose part of that value proposition, or understanding that value proposition, is also taking some advice, because it's unlikely that some people would tell you what the possibilities are in terms of flexibility and breaking up your approach to save you money if they see you're in a place where they could sell you a particular service. But that's me being very cynical for a moment.
Cynical mode off.
Yeah, absolutely. Toby, thank you very much indeed for this time. Really, really appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for watching or listening. See you next time.
Thank you for listening to Threatsafe. We hope you found it enjoyable and informative. Please reach out with any comments, feedback, questions, and we look forward to seeing you soon.